what is the proper amount of liquidity which the regulator should expect from bank to have? And the answer is that I'm too large on this picture, and that's better. So the answer was, there's a Basel ratio for this, okay? So I received some questions by mail during the weekend especially, asking, the end of the week I should say, asking me what is the actual Basel ratio. So let me be a bit more specific. If you look at the, Basel ratios, there are at least three such ratios, at least three. The overall ratio is that the capital divided by risk-weighted assets should be above 10.5%, okay? But in that capital, there are categories of capital. There is common equity Tier 1 capital, which should be above 4%. Then there is Tier 1 capital, which should be above 8.5%, which means that between, in fact, when you take those three ratios, you understand that between 4 and 8.5%, there is something which is Tier 1 capital, but not common equity Tier 1 capital. And between 8.5 and 10, I mean, between this and this, there is something which is in Tier 1 capital, but not common equity Tier 1 capital. What is this? The answer is additional Tier 1 capital. Oh, nice. Maybe we shall be a bit more precise about what this is. But just to see you that, in fact, it doesn't appear in the definition, but it lives in the cracks. And in the crack between the total capital and the Tier 1 capital, there is Tier 2 capital. In Basel III, there were even Tier 3 capital, but it doesn't exist anymore. So what are those? I'm sorry, there is a hole in the soil. But when you look even closer at Basel III, there are even more ratios. There is the total leverage ratio, which relates capital to the total assets, not risk-weighted, not filtered, not transformed. Okay. And then there are other ratios such as liquidity coverage ratio, net stable funding ratio, which are basically liquidity ratios. This one is 1 year. This one is 1 month. This one is 1 year. But I'm not going into this because we have to save some material for next year. Anyway, I'll try to be a bit more explicit so that the exercise that we made last time makes a bit more sense. Let's have a look at this. So we said the smallest ratio is common equity Tier 1 capital divided by risk-weighted asset must be above 4%. What we mean by common equity Tier 1 capital is in fact shareholders' equity, including return earnings. So shareholders' equity means the total value of the shares that have been issued, I mean the nominal value of the shares that have been issued, plus the retained earnings, that is to say the profit, the income, which was retained in the company. Okay? Donc c'est le capital social plus les bénéfices mis en réserve. This is common equity Tier 1 because this is real capital. Okay, the value of the shares that have been issued is what has been paid by the shareholders, and of course this appears on the balance sheet on the liability side because it's a debt toward the shareholders. And so is the retained earnings. Of course, retained earnings belong to the shareholders, but it's still on the balance sheet, so it's on the liability side. It's a debt toward the shareholders. Then there are additional forms of capital. Above common equity Tier 1, there is additional Tier 1 capital, which is CoCo bonds. And CoCo bonds can be as much as the difference between 8.5 and 4, that is to say 4.5% of the risk-weighted assets overall. That is to say, CoCo bonds is an important source of additional capital. When you cannot issue equity, it might be easier to issue CoCo bonds. What are CoCo bonds? We'll be seeing. Then, the difference between 10.5 and 8.5, that is to say 2%, can be subordinated debt. What is subordinated debt? Now we must define, in fact. So, CoCo bond means contingent convertible bond. the funny thing is that in France, usually it's translated in the same way, coco bond, while in France, in French, actually, it's not a coco bond, it's a contingent convertible. So you should say a concon bond. But don't ask me why. People prefer to adhere to the English acronym, which is coco bond. Albeit coco in French is quite deprecative, but whatever. So the principle with a contingent convertible bond is that it is convertible, but there are many convertible bonds, and usually convertible bonds can be converted at the owner of the bond's call. Okay? Basically, if you do have a bond which is convertible into a share, for instance, that does exist, it simply means that if the share price rises enough, it will be interesting for you to transform the bond into the share, so that, in fact, the bond features a call option on a share. Okay? But coco bond is not this at all. Coco bond is a bond that can be converted into a share, or shall I say, that can be, in fact, melted into common equity tier 1 when the trigger, which is, in fact, there is not enough capital, occurs. That is to say, in case the level of capital drops below the limit, then, or this one drops below the limit because capital is consumed because you experience losses on the asset side of the balance sheet. Okay? For instance, you have 4% common equity tier 1 capital in your balance sheet. You must write off something on the asset side. Of course, it consumes this. Hence, the level of common equity tier 1 capital drops below 4%. Then the triggers transforms all the coco bonds into common equity tier 1 capital, which means the value of the investment which was done by the bondholders may be written off as capital is consumed. For this reason, coco bonds are risky, and for this reason, they command a quite high return rate, far higher than common bonds. Okay? And then subordinated debt, which you can call as well subordinated loan, bond, debenture, or more commonly junior debt. Okay? Subordinated debt is debt which ranks after more senior debts. Okay? So if a company falls into liquidation or bankruptcy, the repayment of this subordinated debt is subordinated to the repayment of more senior creditors. That is to say, it happens only when more senior creditors get their money back. So for those who love French, this is it. La dette subordonnée est celle dont le remboursement est subordonné au désintéressement des créanciers prioritaires et des créanciers chirographaires. And I remind you that in French, chirographaire means normal. That is to say, sometimes French is far more difficult to understand than English, even for French readers and speakers. Because, you see, le désintéressement des créanciers chirographaires simply means reimbursement or repayment of ordinary creditors, and that's it. So in case you have to interact in your ordinary life with a créancier chirographaire, don't panic. It's not a disease, it's not an illness, it's not contagious. You're not at risk. It's only that, you know, the French legal language, sometimes I'm asking me whether you know, the expert in law in French, they're looking for the most complex word to say the most simple things. Because, is it really reasonable to say chirographer? Say normal. Well, so I do close the parenthesis and go back to my point, which is saying that, okay, let's focus on simply the overall Basel ratio at the moment, that is to say, capital divided by risk-weighted assets should be above 10.5%, okay? And now, let us go back to our exercise, where we had a bank with 40 billion or whatever of government debt, 60 currency units of loans to companies, and with a rating between AAA and AA minus, and 40 units of loans to enterprise with credit rating between A minus and A plus. Okay, so there the Basel solvency ratio is given by dividing the level of capital 10 by the risk-weighted assets, and the risk-weighted assets is that there's a 50% haircut on government debt. Okay, and the reason why there's a 50% haircut is that since the government which issued that debt, or the governments who issued those debts were ranked between the BBB minus and BBB plus, the haircut is 50%. Hence, the capital must be multiplied by the haircut, that is to say 50%. So on the denominator, we put 50% multiplied by the amount lent to the governments. Then the 60 lent to corporations with ranking between AA minus and AAA. The haircut is 20%, so we apply the 20% haircut. And then for the last corporations, we have a 50% haircut. So that overall, excuse me, when we compute the ratio, we have 19%. That is to say, the amount of capital is 19% of the risk-weighted assets. So we have far enough capital because Basel II says we need only 10.5%. So we have 8.5 percentage points more capital than required. Okay? I mean 8.5 percentage points because this is the difference between 19 and 10.5. But of course, those 8.5, if you divide 8.5 by 10.5, then you have maybe 80% more capital than required. So that's good. But what we have seen is that solvency ratios were procyclical because, for instance, if the cycle crashes, if the economy crashes, then all ratings deteriorates by one notch, or I shall say one notch class. Okay, that is to say, those assets who had a 50% haircut now go into the category where the haircut is 100%, so it's 1. Okay, so these were the governments with debt, with credit rating between BBB minus and BBB plus. Now, with the recession, they go down between BB minus and BB plus. That is to say, they lose their when you're BBB plus, you're supposed to be investment grade. Below, you're no longer investment grade, you become junk. Okay, so government debts become junk, and the haircut jumps from 50% to 1. Then the clean corporations, they go down from AA minus to AAA. They go down to AA to A. Okay, hence the haircut jumps to 50%. And then the last categories of debt, which were corporate debt between I don't remember, but between A and AA, for instance, it goes down to A plus to an A minus. So the haircut is 1 again. So now, of course, the denominator has jumped because every haircut has been rising. And now when you compute the capital ratio, it's 9%. That is to say, it's below the required 10.5%. So we don't have enough capital. Not because the amount of capital has changed, not because the asset side of the balance sheet has changed, but simply because the haircuts which are applied to those assets have changed because of the deteriorating economic conditions which led to lower credit rating, which led in their turn to higher haircuts, that is to say higher required capital or higher capital requirements. So on the one hand, this is good because it means that the supervisor takes into account the riskiness of the assets to when it counts the amount of capital which is required. So we say that the capital model is risk sensitive. So it seems reasonable to assess the riskiness of the asset before computing required capital. But on the other hand, we see that this leads to a problem because during good times, the capital requirements are quite low, and when the economic situation worsens, banks are expected to have more capital with the same assets, or to drop their assets. But this will probably fuel the crisis. Okay, so this was the idea which was behind deleveraging, because if we think of deleveraging, let's start with you see the poorly capitalized bank. It has only 4 in capital, so let's assume that the poorly capitalized bank on this side loses 2, because, for instance, 2 is lost on the asset side because of the crisis. Hence, this loss is, of course, taken from the capital. Hence, the amount of capital is now only 2, while we're in an imaginary world where the required capital is 4%. So we were okay with 4 out of 100, but in case we have losses of 2 there, we lose 2 there, and so we have only 2. Hence, we should have only 50 as total balance sheet. Or, so there are two possibilities. Either we raise another 2 in capital, so we have enough capital, okay. Or we deleverage, that is to say, we reduce the balance sheet size to 1/2 of what it was. That is to say, we have to sell 1/2 of the balance sheet. Usually, when corporations enter a recession, it's not the best time of the year or the best time to issue capital. Hence, it can be difficult to raise capital. You can issue CoCo bonds, you can issue subordinated debt, we have seen this. But, in fact, the loss have been taken from Common Equity Tier 1. So normally you should issue mainly, you should issue shares. And issuing shares in time of recession can be quite difficult. So what happened is that bank should be led to deleverage. By deleveraging, we mean what? We mean that overall, since we have only 2 in capital, and since capital requirements are 4% of the whole balance sheet, then we need to sell so that the total value of the balance sheet is only 50. And of course, we cannot sell the reserves because there is no point selling the cash we have stored at the central bank. So what we do is that we sell the loans. So we sell the return-bearing assets. Okay, but doing so, and of course, while selling the loan as well, we reduce the deposits. But if we do so, the result is that basically we can no longer lend to the economy. And since the economy is already in crisis, in recession, it will of course fuel the recession. And it is quite obvious that we will find anyone to buy our assets at their market price. They will probably try to discount the asset before buying them. So we'll probably lose more than the theoretical value of the asset. There will be an illiquidity or a crisis, a negative premium, etc. So deleveraging is, the problem here is that deleveraging is bad for the economy, and it appears to be a consequence of the prudential ratios which are required by Basel regulations and hence by banking regulation all over the world. So in order to address a bit more precisely this topic, we'll be looking maybe more precisely into asset valuation on the one hand, then into what capital is more precisely, just to make the picture crisper, okay? Yeah?
So what happened with banks that held a lot of maybe bonds or the bonds that came from countries that disappeared? Like, for example, in the case of Russia, before it became the Soviet Union, there was an article in The Economist that there was actually people that had bought these bonds before.
Yeah, and in this country we know this quite well.
Yeah,
but first, by that time, in fact, there were no capital requirements for banks. I mean, there were capital requirements, but they were loose, and the banks were not supervised in a way so that the Banque de France was able to look at the, you know, the financial statement and into the detail of capital adequacy. Okay, and I shall say that in fact banks were not directly supervised, so there were nothing such as capital requirements. The first formal capital requirements were part of the Basel Agreement, which were signed in 1987. Okay, so now if we look at for instance, the Russian bonds which were issued in Paris since the 1880s, because I think the issuance of Russian bonds started in Paris in 1886, and before they were issued in Berlin. The point is that they were massively bought by investors, not banks. That is to say, in that time, in fact, in that time, banks were far, I shouldn't say far more prudent, but they were not investing into the same kind of instruments. In that time, banks were more relying on discounting bills of commerce and on making loans and on investing into short-term debt instruments issued by the government. So banks were very prudent in the sense that they did not invest into long-term, high-risk instruments, such as the bond issued by or guaranteed by the Russian government. So the losers, when the Soviet government defaulted on the bonds in 1917, right after the October Revolution, the losers were the French investors, the physical persons, not legal persons. And this has been a thorn in the heel of the French-Russian relation for a long time, until Boris Yeltsin himself decided to pay back the debt in 1991. Of course, it was paid at a far thing of the overall value, but that claim was settled. Now, basically, the point is simply that when there is an asset write-off, this should be taken from the equity, from the capital. And maybe, in fact, what triggered the Basel Agreement in 1987 was one of the many Mexican crises that happened, and it was a Mexican crisis of 1982, where Mexico, albeit it benefited from the oil crash, the oil boom, which sent the oil price, the oil shock, that's it, which sent the oil price very, very high. In fact, Mexico, the state who had the monopoly on the production of oil, expended oil money for social benefits, and in fact, it went bankrupt around 1984. So the problem is that those who lent to the Mexican government or to Mexican government guaranteed corporation by that time were American banks in that case. So the Secretary of State, Brady, the American Secretary of State, had to find a solution to avoid bankruptcy for the American banks. And the solution in this case was the substitution of the original bonds, or was the substitution of Brady bonds for the original bonds. That is to say, basically, the debt was renegotiated, and which is usually what happens in case of such default. So one even more recent example was the Greek default, into the Greek sovereign debt crisis in 2012. This is especially interesting because there was a huge amount of credit default swap which was sold on the Greek debt. So the Greek debt crisis was really critical, not just from the point of view of the solvency of the European banks, where it was probably not as critical because basically the Greek economy is small. So albeit some banks, some European banks had bought quite a large amount of Greek debt, this was not a matter of percentage of the overall balance sheet. So it was something, but not that huge. There was that political problem, which is, of course, that Greece was a member of the European Union, so we should have cared for Greece, which in fact did not happen. But in the end, what remained was the moral problem of if the default of the great Greek state was acknowledged, then this was considered as a debt event, and then the CDS would be unfolded. But you know what I mean by CDS, credit default swap. Okay, it means that some people bought a financial instrument which was supposed to give them some money in case the Greek state defaulted on the bonds which it issued. Okay. So in fact, the shall I say resolution of the Greek state mainly focus on this. That is to say, avoiding that people take profit from the trouble in the Greek state. So some people made profit probably, but not the buyers of CDS. But so in the end, what was decided was that the bank would, by themselves, take a 50% haircut on the Greek bonds. That the bank themselves decide that the Greek bonds were only worth 50% of their face value, and so expect only 50% repayment from the Greek government. So this was the restructuration, another renegotiation of the debt, which was performed by political authorities because the so-called Troika was the European Commission, the IMF, and the World Bank together, the ECB and the IMF and the European Commission, and together they decided this. Okay, so basically, when something of this level happens, go for a good restructuring with government or international organization guarantee and brokerage of the deal. That's it. Well, when we think of valuation of assets, in fact, things should be looked at into some detail, because there is the methods of valuing financial assets are not. There is no unique method, and so there are different methods. Moreover, the method changed, and so there is some points asking which method is the best. Okay. So, in fact, when you look at bank asset portfolio, you see that there are three kinds of instruments are classified or ranked or arranged by their purpose, and the same instrument, for instance, a stock or a bond, because this applies only to bonds, could be considered either as a held-to-maturity asset, that is to say, this only applies to debt. This category only applies to debt security held to maturity. It means that you buy the debt security either on issuance or at some point, and then you take it in a category which is that you will keep that asset until it's paid back. Okay. If you do this, then the accounting method for this kind of asset is amortized cost. Okay. While if the asset is available for sale, you will use fair value accounting and gains, the profits, which are still not realized because you did not sell the asset. For instance, assume you buy a stock at 100 euro and you intend to sell it at some point. Okay, for a stock, you will have to sell it before the 99 years expiry of the stock. Okay, if for instance the stock lists for 120, then your profit is 20 because you bought 100. Your profit is 20. The current price is 20. The profit is the difference between the price you paid and the price on the market. But in this case, this profit can be counted in the earnings, in the profits and losses, so they will appear in the profits. For instance, if the banks compute the balance sheet on December the 31st, and the bank has bought a stock 100 in January, and in December the stock is worth 120, then you report 20 in the profits because the stock is available for sale. Now, if the stock is considered a trading asset, you cannot count this into the profit. You cannot count this profit directly into the profit done during the year. You must count it in a special account, which is, in fact, not fiscal tax profits, but virtual profits. Why is there such difference? Because in fact, there are not the same requirements in terms of regulatory capital for both. Okay, that is to say, for trading assets, you take the 10-day 99% VAR, while for available for sale, you take the 1-year 95% VAR. So, not the same accounting and not the same risk-weighted assets. Two different methods. What's behind? You must understand that eventually the Basel Agreement was a political agreement between 27 countries, and it was an agreement between bank lobbies on the one hand, ministers of finance, and, well, politicians and professionals. So everything has been negotiated, and in the end, this is what we see, okay? But let's simply focus on amortized cost on the one hand, fair value accounting on the other hand. The main idea is that if you buy an asset and intend to keep it, to hold it until maturity, then you account the asset as amortized cost, and the profit will only be accrued at the end, you know, when at maturity, when the asset is paid back. Well, if you buy an asset and intend to sell it back, then you can count the difference between the buying price and the current market price in the profits. But if you do this, you must also report the losses, conversely. Okay, so when we think of amortized cost, debt instruments are accounted at their initial cost, that is to say, the cost you bought. And of course, from that initial amount, you will subtract the amount which is paid back at the time where it is paid back, okay? Or the depreciation if it's not paid back. In French, you would not say, you can say coût amorti, but you'd rather say valeur historique. Okay? So basically, amortized cost means amortized. The idea is, you know, amortization means paying back. Okay? L'amortissement, c'est payer, c'est rembourser un emprunt. Amortir un emprunt, c'est le rembourser. So amortized cost means basically you count the buying cost, and then you only count the incoming flows when they happen. While in terms of fair value, you can even count the flows which did not happen so far, because you can count the virtual profit which is not done on an asset when the market price is above the price you paid. Okay, so this is past tense, amortized cost, because basically things happen into the account, into the financial statement only when things happened, not when they are virtual. Now, how should we depreciate a loan or an asset in this kind of accounting? The usual method was incurred loss. Okay, so depreciation of an asset only happen when an objective information that revenue flows are affected happens. Okay, that is to say, simply. So this is the result of IAS 39. That is, IAS means International Accounting Standard, and IAS International Accounting Standards were old accounting standards, because since 2005, accounting standards are no longer IAS, they are IFRS, that is to say, International Financial Reporting Standards. So when you see IAS, it means it's no longer in force. Now, accounting standards are IFRS, with the number of the norm, of the standard. Okay. So in the past, depreciation in amortized cost approach required an objective information that the revenue flow were affected. For instance, if you lent money to a borrower and that borrower, until that borrower actually gone bankrupt, there was no reason to depreciate the value of a loan which you granted to that borrower. Even if you knew that he was going bankrupt, even if you knew that he was no longer going to pay. But as long as there was no court ruling in France, or no Chapter 11 filing or whatever, you should do nothing on the balance sheet. While since the entry in force of IFRS 9 in 2018, the correct approach is expected loss. That is to say, depreciation is now justified if there is a probability of loss. And the probability should be based on rigorous estimations, so either a decline in rating if the borrower is rated by a rating agency, or if you use a scoring model, okay, actual information that shows that the borrower is going to be in trouble. The difference between those two methods is that this one is more sensitive, okay, because you can use information to adapt or to revise the value of your assets before it's too late. But the point is that it does give the bank discretion on doing this, because, of course, when we think of borrowers who are rated, then we know that the value of the assets should be modified. But when you think of this, basically, when you're looking for a rating, your point is rarely to go to a bank. When you're buying a rating from a rating agency, your point is more to go to the financial market and borrow on the financial market. So basically, those who borrow from the banks, they don't have ratings. Or, a large part of those who borrow from the bank do not have ratings. Hence, they are rated by the banks. Hence, the bank can do whatever it wants, can, up to a certain point, manipulate the value of the asset. Because if the bank decreases the value of the asset, it consumes capital, and it lowers the capital ratio, etc. Okay, so you see that this is better than this on the paper and as an accounting principle. But the point is that the estimation of the creditworthiness of borrowers is left up to the bank, up to a certain point. So what is sure is that the incurred loss method is massively procyclical. So the first one. It is even considered to be one of the causes of the financial crisis. Because basically, the bank did not report losses until losses were actual. And at that point, the capital, well, when you look at, for instance, Lehman Brothers, they did not anticipate what they knew. That is, that basically they were consuming capital. And they were not forced to revise the asset value because of the incurred loss approach. Okay? So expected loss is better because it's, in fact, it is more risk sensitive because it takes into account all available information, can we say as economists, but it gives a lot of discretion to banks. Hence, the supervisors should be very careful about the creditworthiness models of the bank. Well, not next week, but the week right after, we'll have an analyst from Standard & Poor's who he will be talking through Zoom. Oh yeah, question, sorry. I'm sorry. I don't hear you. So if you don't mind, I'm just repeating this for the computer. So the question is what is actually the difference between incurred and expected loss? Well, as the words say, incurred means the loss already happened. So there is an event which shows that the asset has lost part of its value. Because, for instance, the borrower has become bankrupt. Hence, this means that once there is no objective event, there is no need for you to revise, to revalue the value of the asset. Okay? So, for instance, as long as the creditor is not bankrupt, you can count the loan with the same value, albeit he has not been paying for 2 years. But he's not bankrupt. There is an objective decision. With the expected loss approach, you're supposed to take advantage of all the available information, even if it's not related to facts, to hard facts, such as the borrower is bankrupt. But you know, for instance, that he asked for a credit line. So you know that he's no longer liquid. You know that he's going to file for Chapter 11 in the coming weeks. Okay? So, well, this shows you that something is happening and that you should change the value of the asset as reported in the balance sheet. So the difference here is that basically the way the creditworthiness is hence by creditworthiness I mean the value of the asset is counted, depends on bank discretion, that is to say on a model which the bank designed to assert the creditworthiness of every borrower. Hence, well, for instance, this is what we call scoring models, okay? You know that when a bank wants to, well, if you apply for a credit with your bank, you will go to the bank, you will ask for the credit, and then they will ask you many questions. How old are you? Do you have university grades? What's your job? How much are you earning? What do you own? Do you have real estate properties? Do you have financial assets? And they will enter this into the computer, and in the end, the computer will say, okay, to Miss X, we can lend as much as 200,000 euros at 1.5%. And this is the result of the scoring model, which in fact compares your personal data to the database of all the borrowers of the bank and assess your risk. If you're too risky, they will refuse you a loan. If you're not risky, well, if your risk is compatible with the lending standards, you will be given an offer which is a function of your creditworthiness. And so the point is that, in fact, before 2017, scoring models were, and so the models which decided the creditworthiness of a borrower were, well, you could opt for a very simple approach, but you could also build your own model that would say to the supervisor how much capital was required for a given loan. In fact, since the package which is called Basel IV and which was issued in 2017, there are floors, which is to say the banks do not have complete discretion on how they can value loans and other assets and how much capital they must have. So that is to say the discretion for bank has been reduced somewhat. Well, I don't think this is well. Okay, so in order to compute you see, there must be a model of creditworthiness. There must be as well a model of loan depreciation. Well, the same is a model of loan depreciation. Okay, and the point is that in that model of loan depreciation, the loss rate should be related to the idea is that a good model is a model that gives the largest frequency to a loss rate which is not too high. Okay, so if your loss rate is the frequency of a high loss rate is high as well, then you shall not lend. Okay, while it is quite admissible that you do have a quite high frequency for a low loss rate, because it happens that people go into trouble. Of course, this frequency, this is not 100%. Okay, actually, being above 6% non-performing loans is a real issue. So this frequency should be no more than a couple of percent. Okay. Now, this was for amortized cost, and the accounting method for amortized cost has changed, and that change was driven by the idea that so far amortized cost was not reactive enough to the changes in the environment, so that banks and credit institutions in general could use amortized cost to conceal their losses, while with expected loss, they are required to report future anticipated losses. Okay. Now, for those assets which are not held to maturity, which are either available for sale or trading assets. Okay? The idea is that we will value them using fair value accounting, which is, alors là, c'est plus la comptabilité en valeur historique. En français, ça s'appelle la comptabilité en juste valeur. And, well, there's something which is quite strange, which is, if you think about this, fair value is not juste valeur. A fair price is not le juste prix. Because le juste prix, which is a concept which is typical of this house, because it was discussed by Saint Thomas and other guys 8 centuries ago, but here, le juste prix means a price which will not send you to hell. Okay? And because le juste prix is something which is in relation to God, okay? And to justice. And it does exist in English as well as just price. Okay? While when you think of a fair price, it's okay. But okay is different from being justice, from being the incarnation of justice. Okay? So what is a fair value? Fair value is an amount at which an asset could be exchanged between knowledgeable and willing parties in an arm's length transaction. By arm's length, it means that you're not my friend, you're not my cousin, you're not my mistress, you're not whatever, okay? We have no personal relation. We're just parties on the market, and we have no special relation. So fair value means an acceptable market price between knowledgeable and willing parties. Okay, I know I'm not coming with a gun to tell, will you accept to sell me that? No, this is not a fair value. Okay, that's it. I'm not talking to a child. Okay, he's 5 years old, and I'm asking him, will you sell me your bonds? No, of course not. So willing and knowledgeable parties, no personal relations. So in fact, a normal market relation. But you may immediately think, what would you do when there is no market? Fortunately, the IFRS, so the International Financial Reporting Standard, provided for your question. Because there are 3 levels of fair value accounting for financial assets. In level 1, fair values are derived from quoted market price for identical assets or liabilities from an active market for which an entity has immediate access. Okay, so level 1 is basically you do have a market, you go to the market and you ask the market for the price of the asset you're trying to value. That's it. That sounds quite sound. Now level 2, where there are market prices available for similar as opposed to identical assets or liabilities. There are market prices, but not market prices for that asset or liability, but for asset or liability which are similar. That is to say, you will have to build a model to value your own asset from similar assets. For instance, you have a 5% 10-year bonds on that borrower. There is no such other bond on the market because you own all the bond. So you go for a 7% 12 years bond. And then, what are you doing? Are you using the yield curve? Are you using, but what yield curve? The yield curve of the government bonds? You see, basically, there are similar assets. That is to say, you must build a model to value your own asset from market data and your model. Then, there is level 3 assets, okay? If values for level 1 or 2 are not available, fair value is estimated using valuation techniques. Okay. And then? And valuation techniques, and we don't need to input data from actual markets. So, usually analysts call level 1 mark-to-market. Mark-to-market is quite customary expression, which means the asset is marked according to market data, market prices. Level 2 is extended mark-to-market. And level 3 is mark-to-myself. Basically, I do the assumption that I feel consistent with what I need, and then go on. So, while fair value accounting appears perfectly sound when we are talking about level 1, level 2 is quite interesting when you're studying finance because, okay, you're using data and a model, and that's fine. Level 3 is a bit more controversial because basically there is no benchmark, okay, except analyst consensus. And remember, in this place where the analyst consensus is a really interesting concept. Because you know what was the consensus of the analysts at the beginning of the 16th century, the 17th century? The consensus of the analyst is that the sun was circling around the earth. And if you did not agree, then you could be burnt. So sometimes the analyst consensus is not exactly the best guide for making rational decisions. Okay? Nevertheless, there are still large advantages to fair value accounting. Because first, when market prices are available, they reflect market price. So it enables any party to have a clear picture of the firm's financial situation. So this does contribute to good governance. And this also allows to take fast action to diminish risk when something wrong is happening. Because, you know, the asset and liability sides are reported in market prices. For instance, it is quite obvious that the Japanese crisis of the 1990s on the one hand and the saving and loans crisis of 1992 and later in the US, do you know what the saving and loans crisis was? Well, saving and loans are not exactly banks because, well, saving and loans en français c'est des caisses d'épargne. So usually they do not intend to give you payment instruments. They take your money, they pay you an interest, but you're not supposed to use this deposit to pay for expenses. So they are term accounts, okay? But at the beginning of the 1990s, there was a huge crisis in the US. At the beginning of Bill Clinton's first term, a huge crisis with more than 200 institutions going bankrupt. And saving and loans by that time used the money from the deposits to lend to people in order to buy their house. Okay, so they did mortgage loans. But at the beginning of the 1990s, the saving and loans were interested in doing more risky investment in order to get higher returns. The point is that they were doing amortized accounting, and they did not report losses. They did not report losses for months and for years. So at some point, their asset side was completely fictitious, and they went to be illiquid. So they filed for bankruptcy, and the accountant thought that, you know, this was only a liquidity problem. But when looking at the actual balance sheet, what happened is that most of the asset side was completely rotten and worth nothing. So this was the proof that amortized costs approach has problem because, you know, if you, for instance, if you take very complex instruments for which there is no market because the issuing firm simply disappears, okay? Then you can say, oh, I have no information from the market, so I do not change the asset value, and I wait for the crash. And this is exactly what happened with saving loans. They made too complex investments, which they cannot value using, well, which they could manipulate using amortized cost, and they wait for the value of their balance sheet to drop to zero. So this was a huge scandal, and which prompted the application or the implementation of fair value accounting, so that the asset side of the balance sheet would more realistically reflect the value of the market value of the assets, as long as there is market value. Because of course the problem is that when there is no market, or when the market is illiquid, or when the market is a dark pool, for instance, okay? Because you know that most banks now are trading on trading facilities where the prices are not exactly transparent, where and the transactions are not transparent because these are over-the-counter markets, which is to say that the transaction price are not published. So there is a market, but it's an opaque market. That's why we call it a dark pool. And so a dark pool means we don't see through, we don't see the prices. And so what would you do with such a market? Nothing, of course. Moreover, what we know is that during financial crisis, due to the procyclicality, banks could be forced to sell assets, and then the market price may not reflect the long-term fundamental value of assets. Hence, price may react too strongly to recessions and economic events. So we can say on the one hand that prices are too volatile, and on the other hand that sometimes prices do not exist. These are basically the two strongest arguments against fair value accounting. Just to give you an order of magnitude of the problem of non-existing prices. If you look, for instance, at Goldman Sachs financial account or financial statement, you will see that almost every year since the financial crisis, the profit reported by Goldman Sachs is less than what? Than 95% confidence interval for the level 3 asset they do have in their balance sheet, in their on the asset side of their balance sheet. That is to say, all the profit reported by Goldman Sachs is made of how they value their level 3 assets. So the question is whether fair value is any progress in this kind of context. Because if all the profit derives from an instrument which is supposedly valued using market prices, but there are no market prices, what would you do? Yeah?
How can you control that they're not lying?
We control their model. And just for fun, the model for valuing assets by Goldman Sachs has more than 70,000 input values. So the variance-covariance matrix of the model is a 70,000 rows, 70,000 cells matrix, and this is only for the risk factors. And then they are, so this is the risk factors, and then you put input into this, and then you have a complex model for every kind of assets. So how can you control the 70,000 by 70,000 matrix? You have to be very clever. So the guys with the Fed are very clever.
It tries like systemic problem.
Yeah, maybe. Now, moreover, the other problem is that basically the banks are able to pay cleverer guys than the regulators because they pay more. This is probably why Basel III has been toughening every possible regulation over Basel II, so that probably banks are no longer profitable nor interesting for clever people who are really interested in money. So they are probably somewhere else now. But in fact, well, fair value accounting is clearly a progress over amortized costs, as long as we are not talking about level 3 assets. Okay. But as we can show quite easily, the problem with the other problem with fair value accounting is that it is procyclical, actually. So it does amplify the problem which we have seen with prudential regulation of capital requirements. Okay. So I'll be giving you an example which is taken from a paper by Adrian and Shin. Of course, what you can understand quite easily is that if, on the one hand, the asset side of the balance sheet is valued using fair value accounting, which is, volatile with the market value, and if now you value the liability side of the balance sheet using the same fair value, you have volatility on the asset side and on the liability side as well. So your capital is very volatile. That might be a problem, especially if capital might lead to downsizing of the balance sheet. So you have to be very prudent about that kind of volatility because it can have macroeconomic consequences in case banks need to deleverage because of the volatility of both their asset and liability side. So let's look at how fair value is procyclical. Well, I shall say fair value plus the rules banks apply on their management. Okay. So the paper by Adrian and Shin assumes that banks want to keep their leverage constant. Why do they keep their leverage constant? Simply because now, right after this, we'll look at whether the bank leverage is constant or not. But this seems to be the rule which banks rationally apply, simply because their idea is that there is an optimal leverage, okay, and then we should stick to that leverage. Why is there an optimal leverage? Because a level of leverage is a level of risk, okay. If you have more capital in proportion of your asset, then you're less risky. If you have less capital, you are more risky. The shareholders, they buy the shares because what they do buy is a level of risk. So you have to keep the level of risk constant by keeping the leverage constant. So imagine, for instance, you have 100. The value of the balance sheet is 100. So the liability side of the balance sheet is that you have 90 of debt and 10 of capital. So that 90 of debt is mostly deposit, but whatever. The point is simply to say that we have only 10% of capital, and on the asset side we have assets, whatever. What happens is that we're in a booming economy, and the value of the asset rises. For instance, it goes up by 1%. So that now the leverage is no longer 100 divided by 10, but the leverage is no longer 10 divided by 100, but 10 divided by 101. So that the leverage drops. So what happens when the leverage drops? If the bank wants to... So why does the leverage drop? Of course, because if the value of the asset rises by 1, then the value of the capital rises by 1 as well. So the leverage changes quite firmly, okay, quite strongly. So if the bank wants to remain with the same level of leverage, what it should do is issue more debt to buy more securities, so that the capital divided by security remains at 10. So in order to do so, you have to raise 9 in debt and use this to buy securities. And of course, the return on securities, the return on assets should be higher than the cost of capital, because if the cost of capital is lower, then you should not do this. That's it. But the point is that in order to keep the leverage the same, every time the value of the asset rises, the value of the capital rises far more in proportion. Hence, you raise debt in order to increase the capital. Yes? Yeah, sorry.
really have a capital value more than.
In this case, the asset doesn't change. Imagine the simplest possible case. That is to say, we buy only the same security or the portfolio of security, which is the one portfolio, for instance. And the point is simply that we simply imagine that the bank says grows. Because the value of the portfolio increases by only 1%, this increases the value of the capital by 10%. Simply because the capital is only 1/10 of the other assets. And hence, the bank borrows to buy the same assets. So it's only an increase in size more than it can be. You're welcome. But now, we can imagine as well what would happen if, conversely, the value of the asset decreases. Okay? That is to say, know that our asset is worth 110, just figure out what would happen if the value of the asset dropped by no longer 1%, but 1 in 110%. Okay? 1 per 110. In this case, of course, capital would decrease in the same amount. Hence, we would have to unwind bank capital so that the leverage remained the same. So the point with procyclicality in accounting norms, because of course, if we are counting not in terms of fair value, but in terms of amortized cost, there is no need for us to report the change in market price. So if we think in terms of amortized cost, when the price of the asset change on the market, we don't adjust. Okay, and when the price of the asset drops, we don't adjust. So there is no need to change anything. But now that we are in fair value, of course, the asset side of the balance sheet is revalued or is revised every time there is a change in market price. Yeah.
Why don't we adjust?
Why don't we adjust?
When we amortize it.
Simply because in terms of okay. Because in terms of amortized cost, the point is the value which is the value of the asset which is reported in the balance sheet is the value at which we paid the asset. Okay, that is to say, even if the value of the asset rises, we still hold to the value which we paid. We will incorporate the new value only if we sell the asset. That's it. And well, so now you understand immediately why the bankers were extremely in favor of fair value. Because amortized costs mean you cannot cash in the money without selling the asset. While with fair value, you can report in the earnings, in the profit of the year, in the income of the bank for the year, even the profit which you did not make. You bought the asset, now the market value of the asset is above, then this is a profit which is reported in the accounting documents, and you can pay bonus out of this profits, which is only virtual. With amortized costs, you must realize the profits to pay dividends, for instance. Well, maybe a homework that you could do is look at this with high and low leverage and wonder whether procyclicality is increasing or decreasing with leverage. And maybe, shall I give the answer next week? Well, the idea that there is procyclicality, so what I've been telling about the procyclicality of capital requirements is only true when we think of fair value accounting. Because if we think of historical value accounting, there is no procyclicality of the capital requirements. But so when the banks switched to fair value accounting, which was in 2005, then the capital requirements became suddenly procyclical, and hence the prudential regulation tended to amplify the impact of financial cycle, and the financial regulation tended to create feedback loop between economic cycle and bank decision. For instance, if we think of growth, of boom, what happens? Imagine that there is an asset price boom. This leads to stronger balance sheets because, as we have seen, to say things simply, when the market price of assets rises by 1%, then the capital rises by 1% multiplied by the leverage ratio. Okay, multiplied by the leverage. Sorry, so that the balance sheet is of course stronger in the sense that when the price of the assets rises, then the profits in the capital rises even more. Okay, so in order to maintain the same leverage, the banks will increase their balance sheet size, they will increase their assets, and in order to do so, they will borrow to lend or to buy some assets, which are supposed to bring more profit than they cost. So there is a feedback loop during booms, while during busts and during recessions, an asset price decline will lead to a reduction in capital, so that normally the bank should adapt in order to keep the same amount of required capital requirements. They will adapt their balance sheet size either by raising capital, but which is usually impossible in time of recession, or by reducing the size of the balance sheet, that is deleveraging. So in fact, fair value accounting made banks much more sensitive to the economic cycle. So it probably amplified the consequence of the last financial crisis. Shall we say that banks really manage their balance sheet so as to keep a constant leverage? If we look at this graphics, what we see is that this is the total assets and leverage for households in the American economy. What we see is that, I'm sorry, this might not be extremely clear, but this is the ratio of change of the leverage. Okay, this is zero. This is positive change in leverage. Let's say the leverage increases so that the household became more indebted, and this is negative change so that the household become less indebted. Okay, and this is the growth rate of the household capital, and you see that there the growth rate is zero. There it is decreasing, and above it is increasing. So what happens is that basically we see a negative diagonal. Okay, in the southeast corner, what we have is increasing leverage and decreasing wealth. That is to say, when people lose money, they tend to borrow. They do borrow to maintain their standard of living. Okay, and they expect to repay the debt when their wealth is increasing, in which case their leverage is diminishing, because once they are better off, they could pay back their debt. And well, so this is typical of the US, I guess, because probably in France things would be more flat. But in the US, clearly, the household, they tend to raise their indebtedness and thus leverage when they're in trouble, that is to say when the economy is in crisis, and on the contrary, when the economy is booming, they reduce their leverage by paying back their debt, or by becoming richer quicker than they contract debt. Okay? But now when you look at banks, the picture is quite different, because banks are perfectly aligned along zero. And remember, this means the leverage is constant. Well, there are some outliers, okay? But what we see is that there is no diagonal. So there is no directional move, no relationship between the growth in assets and the growth of leverage. Banks who lose assets, will tend to keep their leverage constant, while banks who increase their assets will tend as well to keep their leverage constant. Of course, there are some outliers, but these outliers are not linked to a given level of leverage. It seems that the outliers are around a 2 or 3% increase in growth. Okay? But when banks experience either a strong fall or a strong rise in their net worth, their leverage is not changing. So the assumption that the banks are trying to keep their leverage at a given level doesn't seem that bad. It somewhat models something with the banks. While, of course, it's not true at any rate for the households, nor for the corporations, which are quite more dispersed than the banks. One last word maybe about fair value accounting. One of the main issues with fair value accounting is that it does not, well, it cannot discount bubbles. And one such very important bubble is the carbon bubble. Of course, the carbon bubble is a term which, well, many people do not think that there is a carbon bubble. But the idea behind the term carbon bubble is that the hypothesis that assets of firms who rely on fossil fuels are overvalued because they do not take into account the impact of global warming. And if they did so, they should be valued at a far lower price. So the carbon bubble is a silent bubble because it's not exactly the same as a bubble when all assets on the market are rising, and some analysts think that they are rising too fast. This is the bubble. In the case of carbon bubble, the point is that now that we are conscious that there is global warming and global emergency because something will happen. Well, something is happening right now, and if we don't take strong measures, then the world will be desperate. So the idea is that the price of the fossil fuel producers or industries that rely on fossil fuels, such as cars and air transport or whatever, the price did not change. Well, it dropped since the coronavirus, okay. But it should have changed far more if the future restriction to the use of fossil fuels were priced by the market. By the time it will be done, because at some point it will be done. At some point, governments will forbid the use of fossil fuel. And then, of course, the price of those assets who are relying on fossil fuels will drop to zero. By that time, those assets will be called stranded assets, because they will be stranded. There were assets in the former economy, and their value will drop to zero. So stranded asset is the somewhat dual of carbon bubble, because at the moment carbon bubble is not visible, because it's not the result of a price increase, but it's the result of price being somewhat steady, while the fundamentals should drive a fall in price. So those assets who benefit from the carbon bubble, their price should drop, it doesn't drop, so they are too high, and we can say, well, we can hypothesize that there is a carbon bubble. On the other hand, when the carbon bubble will burst, the asset which benefited from the carbon bubble will be called stranded assets. And by the way, stranded assets is a real issue at the moment. Because if you think of taking radical measures to curb global warming, then you know that some firms will have their value drop to zero. And of course, all those who have a part of those firms, they will oppose any strong measure to curb global warming. So one of the problems of fighting global warming, how could you, retrieve those stranded assets from the market without putting all the burden on those who own those assets? Because if we do not somewhat socialize the loss, then of course there will be strong opponents to any change, to any political, to any policy targeting global warming, because the losers are now identified. The losers are the owners of those stranded assets, or those assets which benefit from the carbon bubble. Okay. And basically, what drives resistance to any policy, to any economic policy in particular, is that some parties might wear the entire burden of that policy, in which case they will be desperate to oppose the policy. So if you do not dilute, or if you do not find a scheme to mutualize the cost of the policy, of course some will oppose it. So there has been, well, there have been, I mean, before the coronavirus, the idea of the carbon bubble was a very mainstream idea. So most schemes targeted at changing the path of the world economy must comprise, yes, clever idea about how to deal with that carbon bubble, so that the owner of carbon-dependent assets won't oppose the changes. Okay. So, for instance, I don't know whether you heard, but Gaël Giraud, who was professor in this university, this summer he issued the idea that instead of buying government bonds, instead of buying government debt, the ECB should start buying carbon assets, so that in the end, the ECB would socialize the loss of carbon assets, bury them, and we could start anew with an economy that would be decarbonated. Of course, this is only an idea, but it's just to show that this will be one. This is of course a problem for the banks, because in this case, the banks will not suffer from bankruptcy from the issuers of the assets. But the point is that we collectively, I mean, policy could decide that those assets are no longer worth anything. So, of course, in order to address the climate crisis, we must address the economic consequences first, or to think of the economic consequences before taking decisions. So now that we have been looking at asset valuation into more detail, maybe we can also look at capital with a bit more detail. Capital is a form of funding that can absorb losses. We have seen this. We have seen as well that capital consists mostly, well, supposedly, capital should consist mostly of the value of ordinary shares and the retained earnings. This is what we call Common Equity Tier 1 capital. And as we have seen, Common Equity Tier 1 capital is supposed to be 4% of the risk-weighted assets. But the remaining 6.5% could be other instruments, such as additional Tier 1 capital, that is to say CoCo bonds, and Tier 2 capital, that is to say subordinated debt. I must remind you there that, first, capital is often called reserves, where in fact it's not what we call reserves in the banking perspective is more the cash which is held at the central bank. This is reserve, but this is cash, and this is on the asset side of the balance sheet. Capital is on the liability side of the balance sheet, so it's not a reserve, or it's a liquidity reserve. It's not a liquidity reserve neither, because it's not liquid. It depends on what instruments capital is invested. But since it's on the liability side of the balance sheet, capital must take some form. That can be cash, but usually it's an interest-producing asset. Okay? Well, you probably all know that the difference between a debt contract and an equity contract, or a debt instrument and an equity instrument. So I don't know whether there is any need to sum this up, but maybe we can recall that while capital is the counterpart of the issuance of a share, of an equity, a share or a stock. The issuance of a bond or a debt instrument give rise to an instrument which pays a fixed interest, while an equity contract pays only dividends. Okay. Well, there are hybrid instruments which can make Tier 2 capital, such as preferred share. You know that preferred share, they do not pay a dividend because they can pay. The preferred share can be what we call dividend pushers. That is to say, preferred share can state the amount that will be paid in the future. So they are hybrid instruments because they are related to shares, but they can pay. The payment that they can deliver can be done according to a schedule, to a pre-agreed schedule. Okay. But preferred shares as shares that do not have a maturity, so they do not expire, so they are not paid back, as debt instruments are supposed to be. Of course, equity, well, shares or stocks enable the holder to go to the General Assembly and to vote, okay, to vote to elect board members or directors. While, of course, their contract and preferred share do not give you any right to vote to General Assembly. When we look at taxation, what happens is that in the accounting of the company, the interest rate which is paid on debt instruments, those interest rates are deduced from the expenses. Hence, you do not pay tax on those interest rates. While the dividends which are paid on the shares, of course, those dividends are post-tax, okay? Because you compute the profit, you pay a tax on profit, and then you can pay the dividends. So it's easier to make interest payment than dividend payments, and it's far less costly for the company because, of course, dividend payments must pay taxes. Okay. In case of financial trouble, the company has no obligation to pay dividends, while the company must pay the interest. For this reason, issuing debt leads to financial frailty because you will have to pay the interest whatever happens. Yeah.
So you know that taxation, so the interest rates are deducted for taxes.
Yeah.
What happens if the company has to pay a lot of debt and they don't have any money left to pay taxes?
Well, this is exactly the reason why issuing debt makes the company more risky, because you must pay the interest. And if the company doesn't have enough to pay for the taxes and the interest, then either the company should get some more debt, so borrow a bit more, or the company should go bankrupt, that is to say, file for Chapter 11. But there are no other solutions. Yeah.
Is this chart from the perspective of the bank or the company? Is the bank the issuer of the debt?
From the issuer. Okay. Well, but not just for the issuer, but also for the... It's a mix of the issuer point of view and the buyer point of view. Because if you look at General Assembly, then this is the borrower point of view. But if you look at taxation, this is the point of view of the company. If you look at what happens in case of financial trouble, this is the point of view of the company. So it's a synthesis of features which have implications in terms of governance and of risk and of cost. Eventually, the point is that in case of bankruptcy, well, either the company can be sold to another company or it can be liquidated. In case the company is liquidated, the owners of debt contracts, the owner of bonds, are somewhat prioritized because they should be paid back before any money can be given to the shareholders. so that the shareholders are called only residual beneficiaries, because they should get any money with the liquidation of the company only if it is left after paying back all the debts, not only the financial debts, but as well debts to the, for instance, to the employees, because their wages should be paid, debt to the state, such as taxes, or debt to the providers of services and goods, etc. So, and usually, when the company goes bankrupt, the net value of the company is negative, hence there is nothing to give to the shareholders. As long as there's some residual value, normally the company should not be bankrupt. Okay, because normally companies do not experience problems because they are illiquid, but because their net worth is negative. The case of bank is different because banks are hugely leveraged. Okay? So far, well, I just told you about preferred shares, preferred stocks. Okay, the idea is that preferred stocks give either a fixed interest rate or a larger dividend, but they don't give voting rights with the General Assembly. Usually preferred stocks are issued on special occasion or for special reasons. So some companies are issuing preferred stocks, but not all of them. Because the point with preferred stocks is that as you do not have voting rights, then preferred stocks cannot be the target of any buyout. So they cannot profit from attempt at buying a company. So albeit they pay a higher dividend, or a higher interest, whatever, they cannot benefit from any capitalistic move. No, I've been telling you about subordinated debt and CoCo bonds, so it's okay. You see that albeit banks are supposed, and whatever corporations are supposed to arbitrage between debt and equity to fund themselves. There are also hybrid securities that usually pay an interest, so they are more on the side of debt instruments. But when you look at CoCo bonds or subordinated debt, they are somewhat they are on the side of equity because they are convertible into equity capital. Okay, or in the case of subordinated debt, in case of CoCo bonds, they are convertible when the trigger event happens, and that trigger event is most usually, because it's written in the law in Europe, when core equity tier 1 goes below 4%, or 4 plus 0.25%. While with subordinated debt is only consumed, hence transformed into capital, then destroyed, consumed, only when the bank is liquidated, not just when the capital level reaches 4%. Now with preference share, apparently there are shares, but they are not paid back, and they pay you something which is higher than a share in exchange for your voting rights. So this is more of a share, this is more debt instruments, but they can be converted into capital instruments. This leads us more generally to think about the seniority of capital. In French, we would say la priorité des créanciers, because in French we are not much used to the idea that the seniority depends on the instrument. In French, the seniority depends on who you are, because in France, the state is above all. Okay, whatever the instrument, the state is above all. And then, right below the state, there are state-like organizations such as l'URSSAF, les administrations publiques, etc. And then the other creditors. Okay, while in common law, the seniority depends on the instrument. So, of course, the most senior form of liabilities are the insured deposits. And by insured, I mean the deposit which benefit from deposit insurance. Those deposits, of course, you must repay at any cost when you're a bank, because your main obligation is toward those who deposited money with you. Then other kind of debt. Then subordinated debt is supposed to be part of the Tier 2 capital, but in fact, it's well, in fact, it's yeah. The seniority is above preference share. The seniority of preference share is above the seniority of CoCo bonds, and the seniority of CoCo bond is above the seniority of common equity. Which means that in case the bank needs some capital to absorb a loss, first the loss will be taken from common equity Tier 1 capital. Then, when common equity Tier 1 capital falls below 4%, CoCo bond will be unbundled, triggered, and become common equity capital. That is to say that those who bought the CoCo bond lose their investment. Then, if this is not enough, the preference share will fall into common equity Tier 1, and that is to say, those who bought preference share, they will lose their investment. Then, if it's not enough, the subordinated debt will be triggered. That is to say, it will not be paid back. Okay? You bought a bond that was supposed to pay you whatever interest rate, and at some point, it is consumed and transformed into capital, then you completely lost your investment. Okay? Then at this point, the bank is going to use what remains to pay for its debt. What remains is those deposits which are not insured by the deposit insurance scheme. Well, this is exceptional, and in fact, it didn't happen since a long time in developed countries. Okay? So ordinarily, normally, the state should come in at some point there and say, okay, all the social capital has been expended, now let's think of something a bit more subtle, because if we start taking the money from the depositors, this might trigger either some social consequences or a bank run for other banks, while with other banks normally the deposits are secured by an insurance scheme. But you know, if the deposits of some depositors start to be used to resolve the bank, this might have some consequences. Albeit, we are not going to try to see what happens, but this is probably the main reason why the last resolution we had in Europe was the resolution of Monte dei Paschi di Siena in Italy in 2018. And basically the Italian state proceeded to smooth it all and to move it in such a way that even the subordinated debt was not consumed. Because those who bought subordinated debt in Italy were middle-class investors, and they could have lost part of their wealth. So that in order to avoid this, mainly because there was a suicide in 2017, which was given some, media prominence. Okay, an investor lost most of his savings because of the write-off of some hybrid debt instruments, so that the government stepped in order to avoid, I should not say the social consequences, because we're talking about middle class, but at least the consequences that could experience the Italian banking sector if some of the depositors' money would be consumed in a resolution. Well, yeah, in the financial jargon, we are used to say that going concern is a business that works well, while a gone concern is a business that is such that it might be experiencing trouble in the coming weeks or month or year. So basically, it should file for bankruptcy. So when you talk about a going concern, you mean that you're talking about a company that goes well. While when you talk about a gone concern, you say that something will be happening quickly. So of course, as long as this is capital, going concern capital, okay? Well, this is gone concern capital because basically when you're expanding subordinated debt or preference share, it means that you need to Tier 2 capital, and that is to say, you already consumed your Tier 1 capital. Okay, so if you're transforming your subordinated debt into capital, it means that not just that you're bankrupt, but also that you don't have enough to pay back for your debt. So that's bad. If we look at leverage ratio in a historical perspective, maybe the perspective that you asked for when you asked me about the Russian bonds, then it is quite obvious that the leverage ratio, that is 1 divided by the leverage, has been falling all along the 20th century. Because the leverage ratio was somewhere between 15 and 25% at the end of the 19th century, and it fell first before during the, in fact, that was a booming era. Well, that was first a depression, then a booming era, then of course the roaring 20s. The capital ratio then fell during the financial crisis, then during the war, and it fell to an absolute minimum, in fact, during the 1990s in America, while in Europe it continued. And the funny thing is that, Basel II came in effect in 2003, and Basel II enabled the banks to compute their leverage ratio using risk-weighted assets instead of total assets. And banks cleverly used financial models to lower the capital requirements, hence the leverage ratio is 1 divided by the leverage, or the capital ratio, continued to drop, well, almost until 2016. At least until 2013, that is to say, at least until the implementation of Basel III. And an example of this is that when you look at risk-weighted assets, or the capital ratio which is derived from risk-weighted assets, then you see the banks in all countries are somewhere between 10 and 20%. And for instance, if you take France, there, using risk-weighted assets, that was in 2015 or 17, I don't remember, but if you take France on average is around 13%. So you would say the French bank hold 13% of their risk-weighted assets as capital. So they seem to be well capitalized, because if you take 13%, then you're right between the First World War in Great Britain and you're right after the First World War in the US. So you think, our banks are strong. But now, if you do not use the risk weight given by models with 70,000 risk variables, in which are supposed to be supervised by the supervisor, if you take the raw asset value, then the French banks appear here to have, well, say, 4%. Around 4%. That is to say, 3 times less than when you use the model. So this is far less. This is capital divided by asset. This is capital divided by risk-weighted assets using Basel III risk weighting. And Basel III risk weighting is, well, as you know, there are many approaches. You can go either for the standard approaches where the risk weights are given, or you can have an intermediate approach, or you can have an advanced approach where you have a model which gives you the weights as a function of many factors. For instance, with Goldman Sachs, the model rested upon more than 70,000 risk factors. So the model can be very complex. But in the end, when you transform the value of your asset using the risk weights provided by the model, on average, the French bank have almost 13% capital, 13% of the value of the asset is capital. While if you look at raw figures, it's only 4%. The point is simply that there is far less capital than is implied by those risk-weighted factors. And so the risk weights, in fact, the models which are computed by the bank and authorized by the supervisors enable the bank to have far less capital than they were supposed to have. Because we said, Basel II requires the bank to hold 10.5% of the capital. But when you look at the real level of capital, it's 4%, 4.5%. The magic being that the models that they use to weigh the risk enable them to vastly decrease the risk weight and hence have less capital. It's not the same in every country, for instance, because, for instance, if you look at Spain, Spain seems to have less than 11% capital in terms of risk-weighted assets. So it's less than France, because France seems to have 13%, so 2 points more. But when you look at the real leverage ratio, then Spain is above France. Not much above, but almost one percentage point. So it's still something. Or shall we take another example? Well, yes, Poland, for instance. Poland is almost at the same level as France. It's only 1% more. Okay? Because there, when you look at risk-weighted assets, Poland is at 13.5%, while France is at 12.8%. Okay? But when you look at raw capital, France is at 4, and Poland is at 9. So they have actually twice as much capital as France, but in terms of risk-weighted, it's only a few more cents. Now, when you think of the leverage ratio of non-financial corporation, it's far more, because usually non-financial in the OECD, on average, non-financial corporations have a leverage ratio of more than 50%. That is to say, debt is only 1/2 of their asset side. And for this reason, I told you, usually, when a company becomes illiquid, usually it has expended all its capital. Now, shall we summarize the problem we have with capital in the current setup? The problem is that if we team together fair value accounting, incurred loss accounting for credit risk, which is no longer well, we're supposed to stop at 8:30. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and have a good night. We'll continue with this next week, but maybe I'm asking you again. Just try to look at how high and low leverage is procyclicality increasing or decreasing with leverage. This is a good question since we're supposed to ask for banks to have a higher leverage, or to have a higher leverage ratio, to have a lower leverage, to be more capitalized. So will this increase or decrease the procyclicality of capital requirements?